The men in the valley gave her until the first snow. They did not say it to be cruel. They said it the way you say a thing that is simply true. That a woman alone, near 40, with empty hands and a dead husband, does not last a winter in these mountains. They had seen it before. They expected to see it again. So they watched her climb. Day after day, she carried stone up the frozen slope, one in each arm, sometimes 3, until her knees shook and her breath came white and ragged. She did not look down at the town. She did not answer the ones who called after her. She just kept climbing toward the dark mouth in the granite, the cave no one else wanted, the hole in the mountain she had chosen as her last and only home. They were certain the cold would take her by Christmas. They were certain the wind would find her. What none of them understood was the thing she carried up that mountain that had nothing to do with stone. And by spring, she would still be there. There are some kinds of cold that live in the air. And there are some kinds of cold that live in a piece of paper. The woman held the second kind in her hands now, and she did not let it shake. She stood at the kitchen table the way she always stood when something demanded her whole attention, one palm flat on the wood, her weight leaning forward just slightly, the way a person stands when they think they may need to move quickly afterward. The paper had come folded inside an envelope, sealed with the dark wax stamp of the company that owned almost everything in this mountain town. The roads, the store, the houses, the mine that had taken her husband, and now, the house she stood in. Marin Calloway read it once. Then she read it again. 4 short lines, polite words arranged in a way that meant something that was not polite at all. The house was needed for another man, a man with a wife and children coming to take her husband's place underground. She had until the first heavy snow to be gone. The young man who delivered it could not look at her. He was barely more than a boy, really. Soft hands, a coat too thin for the cold that was coming. He stood in the doorway, turning his hat slowly in his fingers, like a child waiting to be scolded. He had a speech. She could tell. The kind of speech a person memorizes when they are sent to do a thing they would rather not do. He spoke of the company's sympathy. He spoke of a wagon that could carry her belongings, free of charge, to wherever she wished to go. He spoke of the difficulty, of her circumstances. That last word landed strangely in the room. Circumstances. As if the death of a man underground were a kind of weather. Something that simply happened. Something no one chose. Marin let him finish. She did not interrupt. She did not weep, the way he clearly expected her to, the way that would have made it easier for him to file her away in his mind as a poor grieving woman and forget her by supper. When he was done, she asked him one question, only one. Where exactly am I supposed to go? The boy looked at the floor. He had no answer. That was an answer. He talked about boarding houses in the city below the mountains. He talked about women in her situation returning to their families. Marin said nothing for a moment, because there was no family. Her parents had been gone since she was very young. Her husband's people had cut him off the day he married her, and not a single letter had crossed that distance in all the years since. There was no one waiting for her anywhere on this earth, and the boy could see it. She watched him see it. She watched the speech die in his throat. He was not a cruel boy. That was the thing. He was simply doing what a colder man above him had decided was his job. Before he left, he paused at the edge of the porch, and he said something that was not in the speech. He said it low, sideways, the way a person says a thing they are not supposed to say. "Ma'am, there's a man coming, in the spring, from the engineering side of the company, to look over the records from what happened in the summer." He swallowed. "If you were still around by then." Then he shook his head, ashamed of himself, and hurried down the path before she could ask him what he meant. She did not call after him. She stood in the doorway and watched the place where he had been until the cold pushed her back inside. Then she put water on the stove, because that was a thing she knew how to do. And in a day where almost nothing made sense, a person reaches for the things that still do. The house was small, 2 rooms below, a loft above, reached by a ladder her husband had built and sanded smooth so no splinter would ever catch her hand. It was not much of a house, but they had made it into something. Curtains she had sewn herself, dyed soft with the skins of wild onions. A shelf he had built above the stove at exactly the right height, exactly the right depth, because he had watched the way she moved in a kitchen long enough to understand it. That was the kind of man he had been. A man who paid attention. His books still sat in a row on the windowsill where the afternoon light came in to touch them. 11 of them. She did not look at the books. She poured her coffee. She sat down at the table, and she read the paper a 3rd time. She did not cry. She had not cried since the summer, since the day they brought him up out of the dark, and what came up was not something a wife should ever have to look at to know her husband. She had not cried at the burial where 6 people stood in the wind, and she was one of them. She had not cried when the company's man came to speak of money, and used the word unfortunate so many times that the word stopped meaning anything at all. Somewhere in the long weeks after, she had made a quiet decision. She was not going to spend whatever came next leaking, because leaking was what a person did when they still believed something might be saved, when they thought the tears might wash the situation into a better shape. She was past that. What she needed now was not tears. What she needed now was arithmetic. So she did arithmetic. She found a clean sheet of paper. She wrote down the small sum of money the company had given her, the full and final worth, in their accounting, of 6 years of a man's labor in the dark, and the loss of his life at the end of it. It was not much. It was almost nothing. Then she began to test it against the world, the city below the mountains. A room in a boarding house, shared with strangers, would eat the money in a handful of months and leave nothing for food. And the work down there, the work went to young girls. Girls who could scrub floors before dawn after hauling coal in the dark. Not to a widow near 40, with no trade, no family name to open a door, 6 years of thin mountain air already in her chest. She wrote the numbers. The numbers did not work. She thought about writing to distant cousins she had not spoken to in more than a decade, people whose faces she could barely remember. A letter would take weeks to find them, if it found them at all, and the answer, if any answer came, would take weeks more. By then, the snow would have her. The numbers did not work. She held one more option in her mind, and she held it honestly, because she was not a woman who lied to herself. There were single men in this town, widowers, Men who would take a wife the way a man takes a coat before a storm. For the warmth, not the love. She turned it over. She looked at it from every side. To hand her whole life, her body, her safety, her every tomorrow, to a stranger out of fear, in the space of a few weeks, with winter at the door. It was the one path that placed her survival entirely in someone else's hands. She crossed it off the list. That left the mountains. She did not write that one down. Not yet. She just sat with it. Because the idea that came to her was not the idea of staying in the town. It was something stranger than that. Something she could not yet decide was wisdom or madness. It was the idea of the mountain itself, the land that had been her home for 6 years, the high country her husband had loved the way some men love a thing that could kill them, clearly, calmly, without fear. On his days away from the dark, he had walked these ridges. He had climbed to places no road went. Not always to look for ore, though he noted that too, but because his mind was the kind of mind that could not stop turning a thing over, looking for how it worked. He came home from those walks the way other men came home from church. Lit up. Quiet. Full. She had teased him about it once, about the stones in his pockets, the way they wore holes in everything he owned. He had only smiled and emptied his coat onto the table, one piece at a time, and told her the story of each, where it came from, what it was, how long the mountain had taken to make it. She had not understood the half of what he said, but she had loved the way he said it. And she had learned in those 6 years that a man who can find that much wonder in a plain gray rock is a man who will never once look at his own wife and find her ordinary. That was the thing she missed most. Not grand, just that. The feeling of being looked at by someone who paid attention. She pulled his box out from under the bed. It was a plain wooden box, a small brass latch. He had kept it under his side of the mattress, and she had not opened it since the summer. She had not opened it because opening it had not felt necessary, and because some part of her had known that whatever was inside would ask her to make decisions she was not ready to make. She opened it now. Inside, folded with great care, were maps, drawn by his own hand. Pencil on heavy paper, creased along lines so precise that even now they opened cleanly, the way a tool opens when it has been made well and treated well. There were small rocks wrapped in cloth, each one labeled in his cramped, slanting writing. The writing of a man who thought faster than his hand could move, and had learned to squeeze the letters close. There was a thin ledger of notes, and underneath all of it, a journal, dark blue cover, the corners worn soft from years of riding in a coat pocket, close to his heart. She had known about the journal. She had never read it. She read it now. She read for a long time. She read by the failing afternoon light and then by lamplight, turning page after page through his observations of stone and weather and the way the light fell on the peaks in different seasons, through small, ordinary notes, a good meal, a sore shoulder, the way the town went quiet on the days the machines stopped. There was one short line that stopped her cold for a moment. Marin laughed today, it said. The whole kitchen brighter for an hour. That was all. He had written it down the way he wrote down the weather, as a thing worth recording, a small true fact about the world. She sat with that line longer than she meant to. Then she read on, because she was searching for something without knowing its shape. And then she found it. A single entry. A few pages in, she read it once. Then she read it again. Then a third time. Slowly. The way you trace a road on a map with your finger so you will not lose your way. He had found a cave, high on the south-facing slope of a ridge, perhaps a mile from the town. Deep, he wrote, tall enough to stand in, wide enough to live in. And there was a thing about it he had underlined twice. It was dry, completely, thoroughly dry. Despite sitting above the bed of a creek that ran only in the spring, the stone did not weep. The floor sloped gently toward the entrance, so any water that found its way in would simply run back out again. The entrance faced the south. It would drink the winter sun for most of the short day. And there was something in the ceiling. A crack. A natural fissure that ran up into the dark and pulled air through it in a steady, faithful current. He had held a flame near it, he wrote, and the flame had bent toward the crack and reached upward. The mountain had its own chimney. He had written down how to find the place, the forks in the trail, the split boulder that from one side looked like a great stone chair, the drop down the slope, the way the entrance hid itself behind fallen timber and brush, so that no one who did not already know would ever find it. And at the bottom of the entry, he had written one last line. He had underlined it too. This place would shelter anyone who needed it, if they knew it was here. She sat very still after she read it. Outside, the town went on with its evening. The far-off thud of the great machine at the mine, men's voices coming off the day. A dog somewhere, arguing with the wind. She heard all of it the way you hear weather through a closed window, because something had shifted in the room. For 3 months, she had been standing at the bottom of a well, looking up, with no rope. And here, in her husband's small, cramped hand, was a rope. He had walked that ridge on some bright afternoon. He had stood inside that cave and turned slowly in the dark and read it the way he read everything. And he had thought, someone could use this. He had not known who. He could not have known it would be her. That a paper would come one cold day and put her out of her own house with winter at her heels. But he had written it down, carefully, clearly, because he was the kind of man who never abandoned a thing that still had use in it. And so, across the great distance between the living and the dead, he was still taking care of her. There are worse things to carry out of a marriage than that. But she did not stop reading, because there was one more thing in the journal she had to find, and she found it near the back. The pages there were different. The handwriting pressed harder into the paper. The words came faster, angrier, the way a man writes when he is afraid and trying not to be. He had written about the mine. About a great supporting column of stone deep in one of the tunnels, about cracks he had found running through it. Not the small, ordinary cracks that stone makes when it settles under weight, but deep ones, long ones, running in the direction that meant the column was not settling. It was failing. He had taken it to the man above him, the man who ran that part of the mine. A heavy-shouldered man with a hard, closed face, who spent his days giving orders and very few of his days thinking about whether the orders were right. The man had waved him off, told him he was reading the rock wrong, told him the column had been looked at before and judged sound, told him, in so many words, that a man's job was to dig, not to think. Her husband had not argued. He had simply come home. And in the lamplight, at this very table, he had written it all down. Every crack, every measurement, every word the man had said, because he had learned, over years in the dark, the hard difference between a man who is right and a man who is merely in charge. The two are not always the same. And he had sent his warning up the mountain to the men who owned it. He had kept a copy for himself, the way he kept a copy of everything that might one day matter. The copy was in this box. She found it. A single folded page, sealed in its own envelope, labeled in his hand with the day he sent it. She held it for a long time. She had read it once before, in the first dark weeks. She had read it and put it back and tried to forget it, because there was a grief in it sharper than the grief of simply losing him, because the cracks he had written about were in the very tunnel that came down, the very column. He had seen it coming. He had said so. He had put it in writing and sent it where it was supposed to go, and someone, a man with the power to act, had read it and decided that it did not require action. 3 months later, he was dead. It was not, she understood now, the way you understand a thing slowly and then all at once. It was not an accident. An accident is when everyone does everything right, and the world is cruel anyway. This was something else. This was a warning, given clearly, received plainly, and set aside by the one man whose only job in that moment was not to set it aside. She put the page back in the box, but she did not put it out of her mind. And she remembered then what the boy at the door had said. The thing that was not in his speech. A man is coming in the spring to look over the records. Records. There were records then. Somewhere in an office below the mountains, her husband's warning sat in a file. Proof that he had been right. Proof of what had been done with the truth he tried to give them. And in the spring, a stranger was coming to read it, if she were still around by then. Something settled in her, quiet and immovable, like a stone finding its place in the ground. She would be around. She did not yet know everything that meant. She did not have a plan, not whole, not yet. But she had the beginning of one. She had the shape of a Y large enough to hold a person up through a hard winter. She was not going to the city to scrub floors until the money ran out and the cold finished what the company had started. She was not going to throw herself on the mercy of cousins who had forgotten her face. She was not going to give her one life to a stranger out of fear. And she was not going to vanish quietly off this mountain and leave her husband's name lying in some drawer, marked no action required, like a thing of no consequence. He had said the truth. The truth was going to be there in the spring, waiting to be read, and she was going to be there too. She slept that night for the first time in longer than she could remember, not the thin, broken sleep of the past 3 months. The kind where a person lies awake turning the same dark facts over and over, arriving each time at the same empty answer. This was different, because now there was a thing to do tomorrow that was more than simply surviving the day. There was a cave. There were instructions in a dead man's careful hand. There were numbers to run and tools to gather and a wall to imagine. It was a hard plan, a frightening one if she let herself feel the fear of it. A woman alone, near 40, building a shelter into a mountain with her own 2 hands, racing the snow. But it was a real plan, built on real things, aimed at a real morning beyond the winter. She closed her eyes in the small dark house that was no longer hers. And for the first time since the summer, she did not lie awake. In the gray light of the next morning, she went to the store. It sat at the heart of the town, low and broad, smelling of coffee and oil and dry goods. The man who ran it was old now, broad through the shoulders, with hands that told the story of a life spent in hard work before the work of selling things. Amos Dern. He had known her husband for all the years they had been here. He had sold him every tool the man ever owned, and had listened to him talk about stone with the patient, half understanding kindness of a person who does not follow the subject, but recognizes a true passion when he meets one. He was not a sentimental man. He was a fair one, which is sometimes a great deal more useful. She set a list on his counter. He read it without speaking. Then he read it a second time, and he set it down and looked at it for a long moment, not at her. And she could see him doing the thing she had been doing for days, running numbers, turning the shape of it over in his mind. Then he looked up. "Marin," he said slowly, "this is not a list for packing a wagon." He tapped it once with a thick finger. "This is a builder's list." She did not deny it. She told him, briefly, without apology, and without asking for his blessing. She told him about the cave, its size, its strange faithful chimney in the stone, its south-facing mouth that would drink the sun. She told him she meant to close it with a wall. Stone, she said, not timber. She did not tell him she was afraid, because she was not exactly. What she felt could not be cut cleanly into a single word. It was closer to the sharp, awake stillness of a person standing at the very edge of a decision that cannot be taken back. Amos was quiet for a long time, and then he did a thing she had not expected. He reached beneath the counter for a sheet of brown paper and the stub of a pencil. He pulled a stool around. He sat down, and he began to draw. He had been a builder once, he said, before the store. Stone, mostly. For years. He knew dry stone walls the way he knew the backs of his own hands. He could not come up the mountain to help her, he said. The store ran 6 days a week, and he ran it alone. But there were things she needed to understand before she set a single rock, and he was going to tell her now. He drew her the secret of it, how every stone must lie across the joint of the two beneath it, so there was never a straight crack running up through the wall for the cold and the weight to follow. He drew the slight lean inward, so the whole wall pressed its weight down into itself instead of out into open air. He drew the long, flat stone that would bridge the doorway, and showed her how its weight must rest on its ends and never on its middle. He talked for the better part of an hour, and she listened the way she listened to anything that might save her life, completely, without a single interruption, filing each thing away in an order she would be able to reach for later, cold, exhausted, with her hands torn, and the dark coming down. When he was finished, she paid. The good tools, the iron stove with its lengths of pipe, the one thing on the list that could not be made or found or done without, and which he had, by some grace, exactly one of in his back room. The mortar, the canvas, the lamp and its oil, a good knife, flour and beans and salt and coffee, the plain hard fuel of a body that means to stay alive. It came to nearly everything she had. There was a small margin left. Not a comfortable one, but a margin. Amos loaded it all into a borrowed cart. And when the cart was full, he went to the back of the store and came out with more. A bundle of candles, a coil of good rope, a roll of clean cloth for bandaging. He set them on top of the load without asking her opinion. "You'll need all of it," he said. Then he looked at her for a moment, the way a man looks when he is choosing among several things he might say, and saying only one. "Don't be too proud," he said, "to come back if you need something." He held her eyes. Being proud about the wrong things has killed more people on this mountain than the cold ever has. She thanked him, and she meant it. Then she put her shoulder to the cart and started up the long frozen slope toward the dark mouth in the granite, the cave no one else wanted, the hole in the mountain she had chosen as her last and only home. The cart was heavy, heavier than she had judged. She stopped 4 times on the climb, just to breathe, just to set her grip, just to ask herself whether to leave some of it behind. 4 times she decided to keep going, and 4 times she kept going. Below her, the town watched the woman climb, a widow, near 40, empty-handed, they all believed, except for whatever fool's errand had her dragging a cart up a mountain with winter at the door. They gave her until the first heavy snow. They were so certain. They were certain the cold would find her. Certain the wind would do what the company had not the nerve to do, and finish her quietly, somewhere out of sight. What none of them understood was what she carried up that mountain that had nothing to do with stone or flour or iron. She carried a dead man's careful handwriting. She carried a truth that was waiting for the spring. And she carried a thing harder than granite and warmer than any fire, the simple, stubborn refusal to disappear. She reached the cave as the last light left the peaks. She set down the cart, and she looked into the dark, not as a place where her story ended, but as a place where it was finally, against everything, about to begin. The first night, she did not sleep inside the mountain. She slept at its mouth. She propped the canvas across the opening to break the worst of the wind, and she built a small fire from the dry wood she had gathered on the climb, and she lay down on the stone floor with her blankets pulled to her chin and listened to the dark. The fire was small. She was careful with her matches. But the strangest thing happened. The cave held the warmth. The granite did not drink the heat away the way the thin walls of a wooden house did. It turned it back, gave it to her again. And within the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee, the air around the little fire had warmed enough that she could feel it on her face. She ate her supper, beans, and a hard biscuit, and coffee in a tin cup she held in both hands. And for a while, she let herself simply be still. The firelight moved on the stone. The shadows leaned and swayed. Somewhere above her, far up in the dark fissure of the ceiling, the air moved in its slow, faithful current, carrying the smoke away exactly as a dead man had promised it would. She thought about him, not the summer version, not the thing they had carried up out of the dark. The other one, the one who had walked these ridges with his pockets full of stones and his eyes bright with whatever puzzle the mountain had handed him that day. He had stood in this very cave once. He had turned slowly in the dark, just as she had, and read the place the way he read everything. And he had thought, someone could use this. He could not have known the someone would be her. But here she was, in the most ordinary, practical way a person can mean it. He was still keeping her warm. A man could leave a woman many things when he went: money, debts, an empty chair at a table. He had left her a way to stay alive. She explored the inside fully the next morning, in the gray light, with a lamp and a torch. The cave was bigger than the journal had made it sound. It narrowed at the back and swelled out in the middle, taller than a tall man could reach, the ceiling curving overhead in a way that no builder had ever made and no builder ever could. Stone worn smooth by an unimaginable patience of time into something almost like the inside of a great cupped hand. The floor sloped gently toward the mouth, good for drainage. Just as he had written, she moved deeper and held the torch to the fissure in the right-hand wall and watched the flame bend toward it and reach up. She held her palm there, a current, faint, steady, the breath of the mountain. The chimney was real, and it worked. And then, at the very back of the chamber, she found the things her husband had not written about. A circle of old ash, long dead, pressed flat by years into a gray disk on the stone, like the ghost of a fire that had warmed someone else in some winter she would never know. Beside it, a square of old canvas, folded once and gone stiff with age, crumbling at the creases. Someone had sheltered here before her. Not recently. Years ago. Maybe longer. She would never know their story. She could imagine 100 of them and never land on the true one. But she knew the ending. They had been here, and then they had gone, which meant they had survived whatever had driven them up this mountain. They had lived through it and walked out under their own 2 feet into whatever came next. It was, she thought, a good ending to find waiting for you in the dark. She found the knife wedged sideways in a crack at the base of the wall, as if someone had placed it there on purpose. A working knife, the blade gone to rust along its flat, but still sound at the edge, the handle worn dark and smooth by another hand, long ago. She wrapped it in a cloth and put it in her pocket. She could not have said exactly why. It simply felt wrong to leave a good tool behind when it still had use left in it. That was a thing her husband used to say. You do not abandon a thing that still has use in it. She carried the knife with her after that. And in some way, she did not examine too closely. She felt a little less alone for having it. The work began the next morning, and the work was hard. The first task was not the wall. The first task was the floor. And the floor was 2 full days of labor that would leave nothing to point to at the end, nothing to stand back and admire, nothing to call progress. She did it anyway, because she understood the one thing that separates a builder from a person merely stacking rocks, that everything to come would rest on this. And a poor foundation is not a thing you patch later. It is a thing you tear out and start again. And starting again was a luxury the snow would not allow her. So she swept, she shoveled, she carried out years of fallen needles and small stones and the dust of slow time down the slope and away. She was careful with the old ash circle. She moved it in pieces, gently, instead of scattering it. It seemed right to treat even a stranger's fire with care. By the end of the first day, her hands were dark to the wrist, with a grime that cold water would not touch. By the end of the second, The cave was clean, not bare, not scrubbed down to nothing, but cleared of everything that did not belong. She stood at the mouth and looked back through it, and for the first time, she did not see a hole in a mountain. She saw a room, a cold one, an imperfect one with walls that made their own decisions about where to be, and a ceiling that changed its height depending on where a person stood. But a room she could work with. Then came the stone. The mountain was generous with it. Granite of every size lay scattered on the slope, from pieces no bigger than her fist to blocks that two strong men could not have moved without a lever and a great deal of cursing. She wanted the middle ones, the ones about the size and weight of a loaf of bread, heavy enough to stay where she set them, light enough that she could place them just so, with her own two hands, without anyone's help. She carried them in 2 and 3 at a time, and she laid them out along the wall in order of their size, and only then did she begin to build. She was making a raised platform down the center of the room where she would sleep and live, with a low channel left along the side for any water to run away toward the mouth. Every single stone had to be tested. She would set it with its flattest face up and its steadiest face down, and then she would step on it, shift her weight slowly from one side to the other. Listen. A stone that wobbled only a little could be wedged still with a small flat shim. A stone that wobbled too much had to come back out. She did not rush this. She had watched her husband take a measurement once, twice, 3 times, when one would have seemed enough. And she had learned from him that doing a thing right the first time is not vanity. It is the cheapest way there is, because the cost of going back is always higher than the cost of going carefully forward. Her back began to complain on the 3rd day of it, a deep, specific ache, low, just above her hips, that tightened in the night and was worst in the first hour after waking. She learned to bend from her knees instead of her waist. She learned to take the discomfort as a message rather than an insult. It told her how she was using her body. It told her where to shift the weight. Her hands grew calluses over their calluses. When her work gloves finally gave out at the seams, she wrapped strips of canvas around her palms and kept on. It was on the 4th day of this slow stonework that the mountain reminded her how little it cared whether she lived. She had picked up a stone she had badly misjudged, far heavier than it looked, at the very edge of what she could move with good footing and a steady grip. And she had moved it across a patch near the mouth where the morning damp had settled on the rock. Her foot found the slick place before her mind did. The stone kept its weight moving forward. She did not. Her knee struck the granite floor with the full, stupid efficiency of gravity and bad timing, and she went down sideways, hard, and stayed there. The pain was instant. The kind of pain that fills a person up completely, that leaves no room in the mind for anything else, that turns the whole world for a moment into one white, roaring point just below the kneecap. She lay on her side on the cold stone with her eyes shut and her teeth pressed together, and she waited, because she knew how to wait for pain. She knew it would rise to its worst, and crest, and then begin, slowly, to fall away again. That is what pain does, and she knew how to be still inside it, until it did. When it had dropped from unbearable down to merely terrible, she opened her eyes, and she looked up at the curved granite ceiling, lit gold and shifting by the lamp. She could see the dark mouth of the fissure from where she lay. She could see the faint, faithful bend of the flame, still telling her the air was moving, still pulling upward as it always did. She lay there for a long time. She let herself lie there because there was no one watching, no one to perform her courage for. And in those long minutes alone, with her knee throbbing and the whole weight of the mountain pressing down on every side, the question she had been holding behind the wall of work finally walked through. What is a woman doing here? A woman alone, near 40, on the floor of a cave with a hurt knee, and not one living soul within a mile who knew where she was. If something had broken in that fall instead of merely bruising, no one would have come. No one would have known to come. That version of things was true. She was living in it right now. She held it. She did not look away from it. And then she asked herself the other question, the one that balanced it. If she walked off this mountain tomorrow, where would she be in 4 months? She ran the answer. She had run it 100 times, and it had not changed. The city would take her small money and give her nothing she could live on. The work down there was for younger hands. There was no family. There was no door that would open to her name. The arithmetic still did not work. The cave was still the only road that led anywhere but a quiet, predictable, well-mannered death. So, she was going to stay. The decision did not need to be made again. She was only confirming it the way a person checks a knot they have already tied. She got up. Her knee screamed and then settled into a deep, sullen ache. Bruised, not broken. Unhappy, but willing. She shifted her footing so her good leg did the work of bracing, and by noon, she had set 40 more stones. There was one more lesson the wall taught her before it agreed to stand. She had built the first courses fast, in the early eagerness of seeing progress at last, and one cold morning, halfway up, she felt it. A give, a small wrongness, when she pressed her palm to a section near the bottom. A stone down in the 3rd row had not been seated true. She had rushed it, and every stone she had laid on top of it had been trusting that one to hold. She stood back and looked at the wall. It would have been so easy to leave it, to tell herself it was good enough, to pretend she had not felt what she felt. No one would ever know. No one was watching, but she would know, and the mountain, when the wind came, would know. So she took it down, course by course. Everything above the fault, stone by stone, back into the pile. An afternoon of work undone with her own 2 hands. And then she found the bad stone, the rushed one, and she turned it in her hands until she understood why it had failed her. And she set it right, and she built it all again. Slower this time. It cost her a day she did not have. But when she pressed her palm to that section now, it gave her nothing back at all. It was solid, clear through. That, she thought, was the whole of it. The whole secret of building anything that lasts. You do not get to skip the part you are afraid will be hard. You only get to do it now, or do it later, after it has already failed you. It was a few mornings later, while she was out at the mouth of the cave sorting flat stones from a pile she had built, that she became aware she was not alone on the slope. It did not come as a sound. It came as a change in the quality of the silence, a certain absence. The small birds had gone quiet and still. which meant something larger than a bird had been standing nearby, long enough that the little life of the mountain had reorganized itself around the stranger. She did not change her pace. She did not look up. She simply said, into her work, "How long have you been standing there?" A pause. Then a man's voice, dry and unhurried. "Long enough." She looked up then. He stood perhaps 15 feet up the slope, arms crossed. A man somewhere in his 40s, built across the shoulders like a person who had spent 2 decades swinging a heavy tool in the dark, with a face weathered to the texture of one who had spent just as long up here in the thin, bright air. She knew his face, a little, the way you know faces in a small town. Cale Ward, a man she had heard, who did not speak when silence would do the job for him. She got to her feet, slow on the bad knee, and they took the measure of each other with the plain frankness of two people who do not have the energy to pretend. "What do you want?" she asked him. His answer was blunt, but there was no cruelty in it. "I wanted to see," he said, "how far you'd get before you gave up." She was not offended. She could see it in his face. He was not trying to wound her. He was simply telling the truth, which is a different thing entirely. He had watched her drag that cart up the slope. He had formed an opinion, the way the whole town had formed an opinion. And he had walked up here to find out whether his opinion was right. So she did not argue with him. She pointed to a single long flat slab of granite she had been circling in her mind for 2 days, 4 feet long, heavy past anything she could lift alone without risking it coming down across her own legs. "You can stay and watch," she said, "or you can help me move that stone." He looked at the slab. He looked at the half-built wall, at the open doorway where the slab would have to go, bridging the gap, holding the weight of everything above it. He did the arithmetic in his head, the same arithmetic she had already done. And then, without another word, he uncrossed his arms and walked over to the stone. It took the two of them the better part of an hour. They built up temporary supports on each side of the door opening. They used the long branch she had been working with as a lever, and they walked the great slab up by inches, resting it, checking it, resting it again. She stretched a string line between 2 points to read the level, the way old Amos had drawn for her on brown paper. When the slab finally settled into its place across the opening, resting on its ends, its weight thrown out to the sides exactly the way it was supposed to be, she did not cheer. She checked it. From 3 angles, she pressed down on its center with both palms. And then, slowly, she took away one of the temporary supports to see whether the stone would hold its own weight the way it was meant to. It held. Cale stood back and looked at it for a moment. "Solid," he said. That was all. But from a man like him, it was a long and generous speech. He picked up his coat from the rock where he'd dropped it. He pulled it on, and he started back down the slope toward the town without ceremony, without goodbye. She watched him go. Then she went back to work. He came back the next morning. He did not announce himself. He did not ask what needed doing. He carried his own axe, and he looked at the small beginning of her woodpile, the start of what would have to become an enormous amount of split firewood before the snow came, and he began to cut. They worked within 50 feet of each other for 4 hours. They exchanged, perhaps, a dozen words. And when he left at midday, The woodpile was measurably bigger than it had been. She noted it the way she noted everything, without sentiment. It was a fact. It improved her odds. She was grateful for it. But she also understood something about the man already, watching the careful, wordless way he worked. Cale Ward was not a man who could say, "I am worried about you." He did not have those words, or did not trust them. So instead, he found something heavy to lift, something to cut, some concrete thing to do with the worry in place of speaking it. And she found, to her own surprise, that she preferred it that way. Worry spoken aloud asks something of you. It asks you to reassure the one who is worried. It makes the burden a little bit yours to carry for them. But a man who simply shows up and cuts your wood and goes home. A man like that asks nothing at all. He only makes the pile bigger. The wall grew. It grew slower than she had hoped, and faster than she had feared. The principle was the thing old Amos had pressed on her over and over with his pencil on the brown paper. Every stone must bridge the joint of the two beneath it. Never a straight crack running up the face, never a line of weakness for the weight and the cold to find and follow. So she could not hurry. She would pick up a stone, hold it, turn it, see it in her mind, in its place, in the wall. Set it against the row below. Check the bridge, and then either place it or set it back down and look for another. Some stones she tried 4 different ways before one of them fit. Some she put back in the pile entirely and spent 20 minutes hunting a better one. It was a strange kind of work, like solving the same puzzle 1,000 times, each piece different, each answer hidden inside the shape of the stone itself. It asked for her whole mind, not the dull ache of easy labor done well, but the deep, absorbing satisfaction of hard work that demands everything you have and takes it and gives something back. The wall was never going to be beautiful. That was not the point. The point was that each stone would be held in its place by the weight and the shape of all its neighbors, that the whole of it together would stand against wind and snow and the long lean of a cold season, without mortar doing the real work. Mortar was only the finish. The bones of the thing had to be sound on their own. When the wall rose past her waist, the lifting became too much, so she changed the shape of the problem. She built a ramp of packed earth against the outside of the wall, sloping up to the height she was working at. And after that, she did not lift the heavy upper stones at all. She rolled them, dragged them, walked them up the ramp with the good rope old Amos had set on top of her load, looping it around each stone and letting it out slow, an inch at a time, so the weight could never get ahead of her. A lifting problem is a hard problem. A sliding problem is one a single woman can solve. The mortar she saved for the faces only. She did not waste it filling the deep heart of the wall, which would have eaten her whole supply in the first few feet. She packed it only into the joints on the inside face and the outside face, pressing it deep with a flat stick, sealing the wall against the wind while leaving its center dry and breathing. And when the first cold rain came, a hard rain, thrown sideways on a bitter wind, she stood inside and watched the wall. Not a drop came through. The inner face was dry to the touch, even down low, even where the ground outside must have been soaked through. She put her palm against it and felt the dryness, and she let herself feel, for just a moment, the thing she had not let herself feel in a long while. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter than pride. The deep, steadying certainty of a person who has built a thing with her own hands and found that it holds. She set the last stones of the top row on a still gray morning, choosing each one for the flatness of its upper face, so that it would shed water away from the joints instead of into them. Then she stepped back. She looked at the wall from inside the cave. Then she walked out and looked at it from the mountain. It was not even. The stones varied in their color and their size, the way the granite of that slope varied. The rows were not perfectly level. They followed the natural lean of the opening instead of some straight line drawn by a man who thought a mountain ought to obey him. But it stood true. It was thick and heavy at its base. It had the slight inward lean she had built into it on purpose, and it had a quality she had not expected and could not quite name. The look of a thing that belonged to the place that made it, not a thing forced onto the mountain from outside, a thing grown out of it. It looked, she thought, as though it had always been there, as though the mountain itself had decided at last to close its own door against the winter. The door took 3 more days. She had no sawn boards and no money to buy any, so she split the timber herself with a hatchet and wedges of hardwood, choosing trees that had died standing and dried upright on their own roots. Because dead standing wood splits cleaner than fallen wood that has begun to rot from the wet ground. The planks she made were rough, uneven, but sound. She built the door the old plain way, with backing boards nailed across the face boards in a slanting pattern that would keep it from sagging out of square over the years. The iron hinges she had bought went into a frame she had set into the stone of the opening, bedded in mortar where they met the rock. She had known, building the last rows of the wall, that the frame would need to be there. So she had planned for it, left the place for it. The door hung a little crooked at first. She fixed it with a thin strip of wood shimmed under the lower hinge, and when she pulled it closed for the very first time and put her shoulder against it and pushed, the door did not move. The gaps at its edges she would seal later, with clay and dry grass packed into the seams, a thing she had read of in one of her husband's old books on building in rough country. It was not a beautiful door. It was a door that worked, and the difference between those two things, she was learning, was very nearly everything. She lit the stove for the first time on a cold gray evening. She had set its pipe through the wall at a careful height, angled toward the natural chimney in the ceiling, packing clay tight around it on both sides and letting it cure for 3 days before she dared a flame. Now she laid the fire in the iron box, dry kindling from the woodpile she had stored inside, where the rain and the morning damp could never reach it. She struck a single match, and she stood back. The little flame caught the kindling caught the wood, and the smoke rose, and found the pipe, and traveled the pipe to the fissure, and the mountain's own slow breath drew it up and out and away, as cleanly as if some engineer had spent a year designing it. The fire grew. The iron of the stove began to tick and glow, and the air in the chamber, which had sat for weeks at the cave's steady chill, cold but never freezing, began to climb. Within the time it takes to cook a pot of beans, the room had gone from cold to something a person could honestly call warm. She put her hand flat against the granite wall beside her, and there, in the deep heart of the stone, she felt it. Not the quick surface heat of a fire close by. Something slower, something deeper. The stone itself beginning to take the warmth in, the way granite takes in everything, slowly, completely, and with the plain intention of keeping it. The fire burned clean. It burned clean because the wood was dry, and the wood was dry because she had kept it inside the mountain, out of the rain, out of the morning damp, out of the creeping wet that would have worked its way into any pile left outside. She had not fully understood, until she felt it now, how much of the whole business of staying warm came down to that one plain fact. Dry wood gives its heat to the room. Wet wood spends half of itself fighting its own water, and gives the rest as smoke and trouble. Her wood gave everything it had. She cooked her supper on the warm iron, beans and salt pork and coffee. And she ate it, sitting on the stone platform she had laid with her own hands, with her husband's journal open on her knee, reading by a lamp whose flame stood straight and still and steady in the quiet, sheltered air. Outside, the wind ran along the high ridge. She could hear it. She could not feel it. Between her and that wind stood a wall she had built, stone by stone, joint over joint, with her bruised knee and her wrapped and bleeding palms, and the wall held. Word of her got down the mountain slowly. At first it was only Cale Ward saying very little in the way he said everything. But a man cannot cut wood beside a thing like that, morning after morning, and keep it entirely to himself. He told his wife, Della, and Della told no one exactly. But she let a few things show on her face, in the store, in passing, and the town, which had been so certain, began to grow curious. A widow, near 40, alone on the mountain. She was supposed to be gone by now. She was supposed to have come crawling back down, frozen and humbled, ready at last to take the wagon to the city. But she had not come down. Smoke rose from the granite slope each morning, thin and clean and steady, the smoke of a fire that was not struggling. The men who had given her until the first snow began, here and there, to fall quiet on the subject. Not yet impressed. Not yet anything so generous as that. But no longer quite so certain. And up in the mountain, the woman they were talking about did not know and did not much care what the town believed. She had stopped building her life out of what other people thought a woman could do. She was building it out of stone. But the mountain was not finished with her. On a morning near the turning of the season, she was outside at the mouth of the cave, splitting the last of an armful of wood, when the air changed. She felt it before she understood it. The pressure of the day dropped, not slowly, the way it falls along the slope of an ordinary afternoon, but all at once, as if some great door had opened somewhere far above the peaks. The temperature fell through a line it had been resting on, and the smell of the air shifted to something thin and metallic and enormous, a smell with no warmth anywhere in it. She had lived high in these mountains long enough to know what that combination meant. She looked to the northwest, and the sky there had gone the particular flat gray of a thing that means business. Not a passing flurry, something larger, something gathering itself for a long, hard run. She carried her last armful of wood inside, and then she turned to the door, and her stomach went cold in a way the air had not yet managed. Because the door was not finished. The lower corner still had a gap she had not sealed. The clay and grass were mixed and waiting, but the work was not done, and the latch she had hung was made for fair weather, not for the kind of wind that was coming off that ridge. She set to it at once, kneeling at the gap, packing the seam with both hands, and as she worked, the first flakes came. Not gentle, not the lazy, drifting kind a person stands in the doorway to admire. They came sideways, driven. The leading edge of something the mountain had been holding back, now turned loose and coming down the slope toward the one small door she had built between herself and the dark. She worked faster. The wind found the door. It caught the rough planks and swung them on their hinges, hard, dragging at the latch that was never built to hold against a thing like this. She threw out a hand to hold it, held it with one arm, and packed the gap with the other, and felt, with a clarity that left no room for fear, that she was losing. She was alone. The storm was here. And the one thing standing between her and the long, cold night was a door she had not quite finished in time. Down in the town, a man sat at his supper table with a fork halfway to his mouth, and then he set the fork down. Cale Ward had lived on this mountain long enough to read its moods through a window. He knew the look of a sky that meant a long, mean night. He knew the way the light went wrong before the worst of it came, and he saw something on the slope that did not belong. A light. A single lamp burning high up on the granite, alone in all that gathering gray. The only light up there, because there was nothing up there. Nothing but a woman and the cave she had no business living in. A lamp burning in weather like this, with someone out working beside it, meant someone was losing a fight with the work. He stood up. His wife looked up from the stove. Della, a small woman with a steady face. "Where do you think you're going?" she said. In that, he was already reaching for his coat. "She's not done with the door yet," he said. That was all. Della looked out the window at the snow coming sideways across the glass. She looked at her husband's back as the door shut behind him, and then she went back to the stove. Some decisions, once a person understands them, do not need another word said over them. He made the climb in the teeth of it, collar up, hat down, and the slow, sure, unhurried step of a man who has spent half his life moving through darkness underground and has learned the one true thing the dark teaches you, that panic and haste are the same animal wearing two different names. He did not hurry. He did not waste himself fighting the wind. He simply climbed, one steady foot at a time, while the storm came down around him, and the town below vanished into white. And up at the mouth of the cave, the woman was still on her knees at the door. The latch had given up the fight. She held the plank shut with the whole weight of her body, one shoulder braced, one arm thrown across the wood, packing the last open seam with her free hand, while the wind tried to tear it all away from her. Her fingers had gone past cold into something worse, something far away. She did not stop. She had stopped expecting anyone. She had stopped somewhere in the last terrible hour, expecting anything at all but the work in front of her and the wind against it. So when a shape came out of the white, when a hand closed over the top of the door beside her own, and a shoulder put itself against the wood and held. For one full breath, she did not understand it, and then she did. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. The wind was saying all of it. He held the door shut with his weight while she drove the hinge screws tighter, using a flat stone for a hammer because her good one was somewhere across the room and there was no time to find it. He held it while she ran the clay along the last open seam and packed it home with both numb hands. He held it while the storm threw itself against the other side again and again, like something that wanted in, like something that did not believe a woman and a man and a few rough planks could possibly keep it out. They worked in the dark and the roar, and slowly. The gap closed. The clay set in the seam. The hinges bit. The latch, screwed tight now into solid wood, took hold. And the door stopped moving. She knelt back on her heels, her chest heaving, her hands shaking now that they no longer had a job to grip. The wind still howled, but it howled outside now. It was outside where it belonged. And inside the mountain, the lamp flame, that small, steady flame that had brought a man a mile up a frozen slope in the dark, stood straight and quiet, exactly as it had before. The night went down past cold into something the bones remember. She could not have put a number to it. She had no need of numbers. She knew the behavior of the deep cold at that height the way she knew her own heartbeat, and the thin knife of it she had felt under the door before she sealed the seam had told her everything. It was a serious night. The kind of night that, in a wooden house with the wind finding every crack, would have a family huddled together and still shivering by the stove, burning through their wood twice as fast as it could warm them. But this was not a wooden house. This was a mountain. The fire burned at a steady, modest pace, and the great mass of stone all around her did its slow and patient work, holding the warmth through the long hours, leveling the whole night out, so the air inside never once fell the way the air outside fell. She could feel the cold living in the stone near the door, but she could not feel it in the air she breathed. The mountain stood between her and the worst the sky could do, and it held the line, exactly as she had reasoned it would, on a kitchen table, with a pencil, in a house that was no longer hers. And the wood was the quiet miracle of that night. Every stick of it dry to its heart, because she had carried it inside and kept it inside and refused through all those weeks to let a single piece sit out in the weather. It caught without coaxing. It held without fussing. It gave up its whole warmth to the room and asked for nothing back. The storm could rage 3 days if it wanted to. Her wood would burn clean through every hour of it. Cale sat on the stone bench she had built and drank the coffee she made him. And for a while, neither of them said anything at all. It was the particular silence of two people who have just finished something hard together and do not need to tell each other about it. The doing of it was the telling. After a time, he spoke. "You're not going to leave," he said. It was not a question. He did not say it like a question. She looked at him over her own cup. "No," she said. He nodded once. "Then, Della will want to know you're not dead." He turned the cup in his thick hands. "She won't say that's why. She'll find some other reason to ask. But that's why." Something moved at the corner of the woman's mouth. Not quite a smile, but near it. "Tell her," she said, "that I'm not dead." Cale finished his coffee. He set the cup on the small shelf she had cut into the stone of the wall. Then he stood and pulled on his coat and went back out into the storm as though it were some minor errand he'd just remembered he had to run. She watched the door close behind him, and she sat alone in the warm dark with the wind shut outside where it belonged, and she understood that something had changed on the mountain that night. Not the wall, not the door. Something between her and the people below. A man had climbed a mile through a storm to hold a door for her, not because she had asked. She had not asked. She would never have asked. He had come because the lamp was burning, and he had read what that meant, and he had decided that a woman alone on a mountain was still a woman worth climbing for. She had not let herself need anyone in a very long time, but she found that she could let herself be glad of him. That was a smaller thing than need, and somehow it was a larger one. The storm ran 3 days. When it cleared at last, the world outside the door had been remade. Deep snow lay over everything, soft and blinding under a sky scrubbed clean and bitterly bright. She shoveled out the space before her door, and then she stood back, and she looked. The wall had not moved. Not a stone of it had settled. No snow had found a way through it. No cold had crept in past the seams she'd packed in the dark with frozen hands. The door stood true on its hinges. It had all held. Everything she had built had held. She let herself stand there a moment in the hard, bright cold and feel it. The plain, deep, unshakable satisfaction of a thing built right. Then she went back inside. Because being right about the wall did not mean she was finished. There was another problem waiting. One she had carried up the mountain knowing she had not yet solved it. She had known it from the start, if she was honest. The food she had bought, back when every coin had to fight for its place on the list, had been bought for survival's narrowest margin. Enough to live on, carefully, for a stretch of weeks. Not for a whole winter. She had known that, standing at the counter. And she had made the trade anyway, on purpose, because the wall and the door and the stove had to come first. A full belly is no use to a woman who freezes to death in a house without walls. So she had bought the tools and let the food run thin. Now the bill for that choice had come due. She sat by the stove one evening and ran the numbers again, the way she ran all her numbers, and the answer had not softened. She had enough food for a stretch of weeks more. The winter would last far longer than that. She was short, by a wide and frightening margin. She had a little money left, not much. But there was another larder she had not yet opened. And it was all around her. She turned again to her husband's journal. She had read it cover to cover by now, more than once, but she went back to the pages she had passed over quickly, the ones about the mountain itself, the living things on it. And there, in his cramped and careful hand, she found that he had watched the small white hairs of the high slopes. He had written pages about them, how they moved in the winter along the same hidden paths, again and again, between the shelter of the low evergreens and the open ground the wind swept clear. How they pressed the same gaps between the same rocks until the snow there held the shape of their passing. He had watched them for the pure pleasure of it. Because his mind could not look at any moving thing without wanting to understand how it worked. He had never written of catching them. He had never needed to. She needed to. She spent 2 days reading the snow, learning the small oval prints. The pressed runways where soft bodies had pushed through the same narrow place 100 times. The little hollows under the overhang of rock where they lay up out of the wind. They were there. They were living on the same slope she was living on, eating the same hard winter. And they did not know they had a neighbor now who had read a dead man's notes and meant to put them to use. She made her snares from wire and sticks, the way she understood the thing should be done. A loop set at the right height in a narrow run, with little guiding sticks set on either side to send the animal into the loop instead of around it. She checked them at first light each morning, walking the cold blue snow with her breath smoking ahead of her. The first 2 mornings, nothing. The third morning, a snare held. She was matter-of-fact about what came after. She had not been raised by people who needed their meat to arrive without any honest connection to the life it had been. The mountain fed her. She let it. She hung the small carcass in the cold stone near the door, where the air stayed below freezing, and she stood for a moment looking at it. A few pounds of good lean meat. It does not sound like much, but to a woman doing the arithmetic of a long winter, with the larder running thin, it was not a few pounds of meat. It was a door, opening, where she had thought there was only a wall. It was the mountain, agreeing at last to keep her. Still, the snares could not carry her alone. And so, on a clear morning after a hard freeze, when the snow had crusted enough to bear her weight, she went down the mountain to the store. She did not dress it up. She had never been able to, and she did not try now. She told Amos plainly. She had bought tools when she should have bought flour, and made the trade with her eyes open, and now she was short. She could not pay him today, but she would. Come spring, when there was work to be had and money to be made. She set the number on the counter between them and waited. Amos did not make a speech of it. He did not make her stand there in it. He took out his ledger and wrote the figure down, quiet, the way a man writes down the weather. "You've got credit here," he said. "You always did. Come back before you're empty, not after." He filled her pack with beans and cornmeal and dried apples, and he added a twist of tea she had not asked for, and he did not let her thank him more than once. And she climbed back up the slope with the weight of it on her shoulders, and learned something she had not expected to learn on this mountain. That asking for help, when you have done everything you can on your own, is not the same as giving up. That there is a kind of pride that keeps a person warm, and a kind that lets them freeze. And that the trick of a long life is knowing which is which. The heart of the winter, when it came, was harder than anything before it. There was a stretch of days, she lost the exact count of them, when the cold settled in and did not lift. When the sun came up weak and went down weaker, and the world outside the door was a white nothing, and there was no work left urgent enough to fill the hours. The wall was built, the wood was split and stacked, the snares were set. There was nothing to do but wait, and feed the fire, and wait. And in that waiting, the loneliness she had outrun all autumn finally caught up with her. It came at the worst hour, the dead middle of the long nights, when the fire had burned to coals, and the dark pressed close, and there was no sound anywhere but her own breathing and the slow tick of cooling iron. She would lie on the stone platform she had built, in the warmth she had earned, and she would think, "No one in this world knows what I am, right now, in this moment. No one would know for days if the breathing stopped. It was not the cold that was the test. She had beaten the cold. It was the silence, but she had a way through it, and she found it the way she found everything, by working the problem. She talked to the cave, not out loud, not at first, but she let her mind move through it the way her hands had moved through the building of it. This stone here she had carried in on the second day. That seam she had sealed with frozen fingers in the storm. The shelf she had cut for the journal. Every surface around her had her own work in it, her own choices, her own hard hours. She was not, she realized, alone in an empty hole in a mountain. She was inside a thing she had made, and a thing a person makes with her own hands and her whole mind is a kind of company. It remembers you. It holds the shape of every decision you ever made about it. She slept after that, most nights, and the silence, while it never quite became a friend, stopped being an enemy. Word of her went down the slope, the way water goes down a slope. It found its own paths. The thin, clean smoke that rose from the granite every morning, steady, untroubled, while families in the town below struggled. Cale, saying little, but no longer saying she would surely come crawling down. Della's face in the store, giving things away without meaning to. And it was Della who came up first. She came on a hard, bright day after the worst of a cold snap, walking up through the deep snow with Cale beside her, in a silence that said she had already made up her mind about something, and had come to see whether she was right. She came into the cave, and she stood in the warmth of it for a long moment without a single word. Then she crossed to the woodpile, stacked dry and deep against the inner wall, and she picked up a single piece of split firewood. She held it, the way a person holds a thing to learn its weight, and then she broke a small piece off the end of it. The crack was sharp, high, clean, the unmistakable sound of wood that holds no water in it anywhere. The sound of wood that will give a fire everything it has. Della looked at the broken piece in her hand. She looked at her husband, and then she looked at the woman who had built this place, and she said, with the plain economy of a person who owed no one any performance of humility, "Show us how to build this." So she showed them. Not the cave itself. They did not have a cave. The mountain hands out granite chambers to very few. She showed them the principle underneath the cave, that what kept her wood dry and her body warm was not the magic of stone. It was the simple idea of an enclosed space, sealed against the weather on every side, held at a steady temperature by the great patient mass of the earth itself. Cale did not need a cave for that. He could dig back into the slope behind his own house. He could line it with timber and roof it with boards and turf, and hang a door that sealed against the weather. Not granite walls, but the same idea, in different clothes. The principle was never the material. The principle was the enclosure, and the steadiness, and keeping the fuel where the wet could never reach it. Cale built it in a handful of days the following week, and the season after that, other families on the mountain dug their own, each one a little different, each one the same underneath. All of them grown from a thing one woman had worked out alone, by need, with no schooling in it but her own clear thinking and a dead man's notebook. She had not climbed this mountain to teach anyone anything. She had climbed it to live. But it turned out that surviving had a shape other people could see and learn from. and carry home to their own cold houses. And she found she could not be up on that mountain, warm through a winter that was freezing half the town, and keep the warmth only for herself, even if she had wanted to, which it turned out she did not. It was deep in the heart of the winter when the stranger came. She saw him from a distance, coming up the slope, not the careless way a town man climbs, fighting the mountain at every step. He moved with it, read the terrain, set his feet where they would hold. A man who had learned how to move through hard country. He stopped a respectful distance from the door, and he waited, and he gave his name. Walt Garrick. He had a quiet, careful way about him. The way of a man whose whole life was the habit of looking at a thing long enough to truly understand it, rather than just long enough to form an opinion and move on. And the moment he said why he had come, she knew. She had been waiting for this since a boy with soft hands had stood at her old door and let one sentence slip out sideways against the rules. A man is coming in the spring to look over the records. He had come early. The winter had not waited for the spring to break her, and neither, it seemed, had he. She let him in out of the cold. He stood inside the cave the way a man stands when he is truly seeing a thing. He looked at the wall from the inside and pressed his thumb against a mortar joint to test how it had cured. He looked up at the dark fissure of the chimney. He walked to the back and paced off the depth, and came back and followed the line of the stovepipe with his eyes to the place where it disappeared into the stone. He did not say remarkable. He did not say any of the easy words. He took out a small book and wrote in it for a moment, quietly, and then he turned to her, and he told her what he had come to say. He laid it out plainly, without dressing it in comfort, because he had taken her measure already, and understood that she would want it plain. He had been asked to look into what had happened in the mine, the collapse, the deaths. He had spent the cold months going through everything, every record, every report, every paper that had passed through the hands of the men who ran that mine. And he had found a letter her husband had written, the warning, the cracks in the great supporting column, drawn and measured and described in a careful, slanting hand. It had not been lost. It had not been misfiled. It had been received, read, and placed neatly into a folder. And across the top of it, in another man's writing, in the hand of the heavy-shouldered man who ran that part of the mine and spent so few of his days wondering whether his orders were right, someone had written a short and tidy note, a note that said the matter had been looked at, and that no action was required. She stood across the chamber from him and listened to all of it, with her hands at her sides, and her weight level, and her breathing steady. She did not gasp. She did not weep. She did not sink down. Because she had already known. She had known since the night she opened a wooden box and read a copy of that same letter by lamplight. She had known with the cold certainty of a person assembling evidence, not the trembling hope of a person seeking comfort. What had happened in that mine was not an accident. An accident is when every reasonable care has been taken, and the world is cruel anyway. This was something else. This was a reasonable care, written down, sent where it was meant to go, received by the one man whose only job was to act on it, and set aside with a tidy little note in a tidy little hand. And 3 months later, the column her husband had named came down, in the dark, on the men who had been ordered to keep digging beneath it. She crossed the chamber. She went to the shelf where she kept the box. She took out the envelope, the one labeled in her husband's writing with the day he sent it. And she walked back, and she put it into the stranger's hands. He opened it. He read the single folded page. The cave was very quiet while he read. When he finished, he looked up at her. "How long," he said, "have you had this?" Her voice came out level, precise. "Since the day I opened his box." He held the page a moment longer, as though weighing it. "You kept it," he said, "through all of this, through the whole winter." She let the silence answer him, because what she had kept it through was not only the winter, it was the eviction, and the climb, and the wall built with bleeding hands, and the storm, and every long night alone in the belly of the mountain. The winter was only one part of what she had carried it through. He asked her then what she wanted to do, and he laid out the road in front of her with that same careful plainness. There could be a reckoning, a formal one. This letter and the things he had found would weigh a great deal, and the likely end of such a road was money, a sum far larger than the small, insulting handful the company had once called her husband's whole worth. He said it not as a man pushing her toward it. He said it as a man drawing a map and letting her choose her own direction on it. She was quiet for a long while. He did not try to fill the silence. She gave him credit for that. Then she spoke. "I don't want their money." Something shifted in his face. Not surprise, exactly. More the look of a man who has just discovered that the map he brought up the mountain is not the map of the land he is actually standing on. She went on, before he could answer. What she wanted was not their money. Money moved in only one direction, from them to her. And when it was done moving, her husband would still be exactly where he was, dead in a collapse that a warning could have stopped, his name attached to nothing, his good, clear judgment written down nowhere but in a notebook under a bed. Money would not change that. Money would not change the record. And the record was the only thing she had climbed down out of the warm dark to fight for. She wanted it written, plainly, where anyone could read it. That her husband had seen the failure coming. That he had said so, clearly, in time. That he had sent the warning up to the men who could have acted on it. And that those men had read it, and done nothing, and let the mountain do the rest. She wanted his name set down beside a truth he had been proven right about by the very worst evidence there is. That was all. That was everything. Walt Garrick looked at her for a long moment. She could not read all of what was in the look, but she could read one part of it clearly. It was the particular, careful attention a person gives to something they are meeting for the first time in their life. And know already, they are not going to forget. "I can do that," he said at last. "The report is mine to write, and what you're asking for is only what the facts already say." He paused. "I was going to write it that way, whether you asked me to or not." She took that in. "Then write it that way," she said, "and tell me when it's done." He stayed only a little longer. He finished his notes. He looked once more, slowly, around the place she had built, the wall, the door, the warm breathing stone, with something in his face that had not been there when he walked in. Then he went back down the mountain, into the cold, to do what he had said he would do. She stood at the door and watched him go, a small, dark shape growing smaller against all that white. And she understood that the worst of the winter was behind her now. Not the cold. The cold would linger for months yet. But the worst of it. The part that had lived inside her chest since the summer, heavier than any snow. Her husband had been right. And soon, at last, it was going to be written down where the whole world could see. The mountain had known it all along. Mountains know everything that happens on their slopes. They simply have no way to say it. But the woman on this one had found a way. Spring does not come to the high country the way it comes to gentler places. It does not arrive in a single soft morning, all at once, with birdsong and green. It comes the way a hard thing heals, slowly, with setbacks, a little melt in the bright of the day, a hard freeze again at night, the snow pulling back a few inches from the south-facing rock, then a new fall, burying it again. A long, patient argument between the winter that does not want to let go, and the something else that is coming whether the winter likes it or not. The woman watched it happen from the mouth of her cave, and she understood, watching it, that something inside her was thawing along the same slow and stubborn timeline. The hardest part of the winter was behind her now. Not the cold. The cold still came at night. But the deep, frozen thing she had carried in her chest since the summer. The thing that had no name but grief and could not be argued with. That thing had begun, very quietly, to give. She did not push it. She had learned, building a wall, that some things cannot be forced. You set the stone where it wants to sit. You let the mortar cure in its own time. You do not lean on a thing before it is ready to bear weight. So she let herself thaw the way the mountain thawed, a little at a time, and no faster than was safe. The word came up the mountain on an ordinary afternoon. It came through old Amos, the way most things came to her now, carried up by Cale, or by Della, or by whoever was making the climb that the woman herself no longer needed to make so often. It was the report. The thing Walt Garrick had said he would write. The thing he had said he would write, whether she asked him to or not. It was finished, and it said exactly what she had asked the truth to say. She came down to the store to hear it. She did not read it alone, though she could have. She came down because old Amos had asked her to, and because she understood, when he asked, that he wanted to be the one to read it to her. So he read it. He stood behind his counter in the quiet of the afternoon, with the door shut and the small dust hanging in the slant of light, and he read the part that mattered in his low, rough voice, that her husband had seen the failure coming, that he had named it, measured it, described it in time in his own careful hand, that he had sent his warning to the men who could have acted, and that those men had received it, and read it, and set it aside. The words were plain. There was no anger in them. There did not need to be. The facts, laid out one after another in order, carried all the weight a thing could carry. Amos finished. He closed the page. He set it down on the counter, and the two of them stood there in the dusty light, and neither of them said anything for a long while. She had thought she knew what she would feel. She had expected relief. The clean, simple relief of a thing finished, a debt paid, a door, at last, pulled shut on something that had stood open and cold for months. But that was not what came. What came was larger than relief. It took up more room than relief. It was the kind of feeling a person has to stand very still inside of and let move through them and not try to name while it is happening. Her husband had been right, and now it was written down. For months, the truth had lived in only two places: in a dead man's notebook, and in the silence of a woman who refused to let it go. Now it lived on a page that anyone could read. A woman had carried a folded letter up that slope in a wooden box and refused to let it freeze, and refused to let it disappear, and waited out a whole winter alone in the belly of the rock, to make certain it was finally said. Now it was said. Now the people knew it too. And whatever it was that had been frozen in her chest since the summer, it broke, finally, the way river ice breaks in the spring. Not all at once, not with a crash, but with a long, low, settling sound that meant the water underneath had started moving again. The town looked at her differently after that. She felt it the first time she walked down the main street in the thaw, with the mud sucking at her boots and the eaves dripping all around her. People looked up. People nodded. And the thing in their eyes was not what it had been. In the autumn, when she dragged her cart up the slope, they had looked at her with pity, with the soft, dismissing sorrow you give a thing you expect to lose. Now they looked at her with something else entirely. They looked at her with respect. It was a strange thing to carry, after so long carrying the other. She was not sure, at first, what to do with it. A widow grows used to being looked at gently, sadly, as a problem the world is sorry about, and would rather not think too hard about. To be looked at as a person who had done a hard thing well, that took some getting used to. The men who had given her until the first snow did not make speeches about it. That was not their way. But one or two of them, passing her on the street, touched the brims of their hats in a manner they had never once touched them before. And that small thing said more than any speech could have. And up and down the mountain, behind the houses, the dug-out chambers had begun to appear. Cale's first, then others, earth-walled, timber-shored, sealed against the weather, holding the precious wood dry through the worst the season could throw. No one had organized it. No one had taught a class. The knowledge had simply spread the way true and useful things spread among people who are cold and want to be warm. One neighbor showing another, and that one showing the next. The principle had come from a woman who never meant to teach anyone anything. It had come from one clear mind and a dead man's notebook, and the plain hard fact of needing to survive. And now it was warming half the mountain. Walt Garrick came back when the passes opened. He had said he would the day he left. And he was a man whose word, she had learned, was simply the same thing as a fact stated slightly ahead of time. He came up to the cave on a bright, cold morning, and he did not have any particular reason to. The report was done. His work on the mountain was finished. He could have stayed below. He came up anyway, and he came up again after that. And again. There was no announcing of it. There was no naming of what it was. There was only a man who kept finding reasons to climb a mountain, and a woman who kept finding she was glad, in her quiet way, to see him at the top of it. They talked. Not the careful, limited talk of people with one small subject between them. They talk the way two people talk when they keep discovering, again and again, that the other one has thought carefully about a thing and wants to understand how they got there. He brought her the puzzles of his work, the problems of air and stone and weight. She brought him what she had learned in a place she could not leave, and she found that the line between his world and hers, which her plain schooling had taught her to believe was a high wall, was not really a wall at all. It was a thing a person could step right over if they had spent a winter thinking hard enough. One morning he spread a set of plans across old Amos's counter, the workings of some far-off mine, the paths the air would take through it. She followed those paths with a finger that did not quite touch the page. And then she stopped. She tapped one corner, a small chamber where two passages met. "That pocket will trap the air," she said. "If there's ever a fire in the main shaft, the smoke goes everywhere, except out of that corner. It'll sit there, and it'll fill." He bent over the plans, and the silence that followed had the particular quality of a man checking his own arithmetic and finding, low in the corner, an error he should have caught and did not. "How do you know this?" he asked, and her answer was not a boast. It was only the truth. "I spent a winter solving the problem of air," she said, "in a place I could not leave. You learn what traps and what flows when leaving is not one of your choices." He fixed the plans, and when he sent the work on, he told the men plainly whose mind had caught what their own careful eyes had missed. A second time now, her name was written down somewhere it mattered. Old Amos offered her the work that spring. He put it to her over coffee in the plain way he put everything. The store needed a person who could keep its accounts and order its goods and hold its 100 small details in a single orderly mind. He was good with people, he said, and good at choosing what to put on his shelves, but he was poor with the careful bookkeeping a store lived or died by. He had watched her, all winter, do harder arithmetic than that with far less to work with. He offered her a wage and a small room above the store with a window that faced the morning sun. She thought about it, and she told him she would take it, on one condition: she was keeping the cave. Amos looked at her for a moment over his cup. Then he said in his dry way that the cave was up on the open mountain and was no business of his to have an opinion about, and she was welcome to it for as long as she wanted it. So she took the work. She carried her things down, a little at a time, on the same path she had climbed in the autumn, dragging that heavy cart. But she did not take everything. She left the stove where it stood. She left the stone platform she had laid with her own hands. She left her husband's journal on the shelf she had cut into the wall, in the place it had kept her company all through the dark, because the cave was not finished being what it was to her, and she was not finished being connected to it. She went back up the day she moved the last of her things down. She did not go up to work. She went up simply to sit. She sat on the stone platform with the door open and the spring light coming in low and gold, and the fissure overhead doing its slow, quiet work of moving the air, as it had done before she came and would do long after. And she let the place be what it had been, not just shelter, not just a thing she had built, not just the proof, hard and undeniable, of what a woman is capable of when the world takes away every other choice. It had been all of those things, but it had also been the place where she had sat at the very bottom of her own life and looked around in the dark and found something to work with, a wall to build, a truth to keep, a reason to see the spring. And somewhere in that long winter, between the carrying of stone and the holding of the door and the slow turning of the warmth into the rock, something in her had changed in a way she could not put into a single word, but could feel in everything she did afterward. A kind of bedrock under her. A quiet certainty that she was not going to be undone by hard things, because she had already gone all the way down to the bottom of a hard thing and sat there and stood back up. She would carry that down the mountain with her. She would carry it for the rest of her life. The new life came together the way the wall had come together, one careful piece at a time. The work in the store suited her. She brought to its tangled accounts the same clear, patient mind she had brought to the granite, and under her hand the small chaos of it became something orderly and legible, a system you could read like a wall you could trust. Walt kept coming up the mountain, and then he stopped needing a reason to. And one spring morning, he came to the door of the cave and stood there, at the threshold of the thing she had built, with the look of a man who has carefully prepared something and is no longer certain of the preparing. He reminded her of the first time he had come to a door of hers, how she had opened it, taken his measure in 3 cold seconds, and shut it again before he could finish a sentence. "I've thought about that door," he said. "A great deal. I'd like to ask if you might open it again." She was quiet for a moment. She did the thing she did with everything that came to her. She looked at it, not with sentiment first, but with structure, what it was made of, whether it would hold weight. And everything she had learned about this man in the long, slow turning of the season told her the same thing. That he was what he appeared to be, a man who said true things and kept his word, and understood that a sharp mind in the person across from him was not a problem to be managed, but a gift to be glad of. She stepped to the side of the door, and she pushed it open, and he came in. And that was that. There was a thing she did, not long after, that surprised the town more than the wall had. There were 2 children on the mountain who had lost both their people, one hard winter behind and one ahead, with no one left to take them in. She brought them home. She did not call a meeting about it. She did not weigh it on paper, running the numbers the way she ran every other thing. She simply brought them home one evening, a small girl and a smaller boy. And Walt looked at them, and then he looked at her, and understood that a thing had already been decided. The boy did not speak for the first many days. He had seen too much, too young, and the words had gone somewhere down inside him where they could not be reached. She did not push him. She had learned on the mountain that you do not lean on a thing before it is ready to bear weight. So she gave him work instead of words, small jobs, real ones, a thing to carry, a thing to stack, a thing to hold steady while she fixed it. And one evening, weeks in, while he was holding a board for her and she was driving a nail, he said, out of nowhere, in a small, flat voice, that his father used to do it the other way around. And she said, without looking up, that his father had probably been right, and they would try it his father's way next time. The boy was quiet again after that, but the next morning he was talking, a little, and then more. as though the one sentence had unlocked the rest. She thought, watching him come slowly back to life at her table, that this was the truest thing she had ever built, truer than any wall. A child, drawn back out of the dark, one small real task at a time. And so, a woman who had begun the autumn with no one in all the world. A woman the whole town had been so sure the mountain would take, found herself, a few short seasons later, with a full house, with a man who valued her mind, with 2 children learning to laugh again at her table, with work that fit her hands, and a place in a town that had stopped pitying her and started quietly to be proud of her. She had not gone looking for any of it. She had gone looking only for a way to live. But that, it turned out, was the strangest secret of the whole hard winter. The things a person builds when they are only trying to live have a way of growing into a great deal more than they ever set out to be. The children grew up in the warmth of a house she helped design, with the woodshed dug into the slope behind it, and the wood inside it always dry, and the view of the high peaks they thought was perfectly ordinary, because it was the only view they had ever known. And one day, when the girl was nearly grown, the woman took her up the mountain to see the cave. The girl stood inside it. She turned slowly in the dim light, the way people always turned, taking in the wall, the stove, the platform, the dark breathing fissure overhead. And she said, in a hushed voice, "You built this by yourself." The woman looked at the wall she had raised, stone over stone, joint over joint, in the cold of a long ago autumn, with a bruised knee and bleeding hands, and a dead man's notebook for her only teacher. It still stood, straight and true, as though it had found long ago its final peace with the forces pressing on it, and meant to keep that peace for a very long time. "I had very good instructions," she said. The girl waited. "My husband found this cave," the woman said. "A man named Amos taught me how the stones should sit. A man named Cale carried the ones I could not lift alone." She rested her hand on the cold rock. "The building was mine," she said. "My hands, my winter, my choice to stay when everyone said go." She was quiet a moment. "But nothing," she said, "is ever truly built alone." She kept the cave for the rest of her days, not because she needed it anymore. She had a warm house now, and a family in it. She kept it because it had kept her. And on a soft spring evening near the end of a long and full life, she climbed up to it one last time and sat at its mouth, with the low gold light coming in, and the warmth of the day still living in the stone at her back. The wall had never moved. The door still swung true. The fissure still breathed. She was not grieving anymore. She had not been grieving for a long time. She had carried something heavy up this mountain once, a wooden box, a folded page, a frozen grief, and a stubborn refusal to disappear. And she had set every piece of it down, one at a time, in its proper place. The way you set a stone you mean to last. She had not asked anyone to save her. And the strange, warm truth she had learned, the truth she would have liked to reach back through the years and tell that frightened woman dragging the cart up the frozen slope, was that no one had saved her, and she had not been alone. Both of those things were true. They had always been true at the very same time. She had saved herself, and the whole way through it, there had been hands. A storekeeper's careful pencil, A quiet man's shoulder against a door. A woman who climbed up to break a stick of wood and say, "Show us." A man who climbed for no reason but the wanting to. She had built her own life out of the hard granite of a terrible year, but the warmth inside it, the warmth had always come from the others. The light went soft on the peaks, and the woman sat at the door she had hung with her own 2 hands, in the place that had healed her, and she was not afraid of anything at all. The fire was warm, the wood was dry, and the spring, the long, slow, stubborn spring, had come all the way up the mountain at last.